Welcome to Bibliophiles Anonymous, episode 10. I'm Denise.
And I'm Jess.
And first off, we wanted to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and hope you guys had a really good holiday. I know we had pretty much a low-key kind of holiday. It was just a few family members over and a simple dinner. Nothing too fancy.
Ours was too. It was just me, Mom, and Dad. But then yesterday we went and had dinner with my mom's family. And there were 6 screaming children there, ranging in age from slightly over a month to maybe 7. Yeah.
Wow. Sounds noisy.
Yeah, it was quite loud, especially when they all first got there and they were running around screaming like banshees. Yeah.
Yeah, my kids have gone past the screaming like banshees part for the most part. They were both pretty good for the whole dinner. And right now they're outside, so if they're screaming like banshees, I can't hear them. The neighbors can deal with that.
And podcast listeners.
Oh, yeah. So, have you been reading anything good this week?
I have read. I haven't actually finished anything, but that's because I've been distracted by Lego Harry Potter. My best friend bought it a while back, and she finally got 100% completion on the years 1 through 4.
Mm-hmm.
So I borrowed it, and I started playing it. So that's kind of distracted me from my reading. But I did start The Crimson Crown by Cinda Chima.
Okay.
And, well, I don't know where I put the book to look and see how far I am. I'm like maybe a quarter of the way through it. If she's going to tie up some of these loose ends, she needs to get a move on. Because so far, she hasn't really tied up anything. And this is the last book, so it's going to be interesting to see how this works out. And you really need to finish these because there's a character that shows up in book 2, that I was just like, wow, wasn't expecting that.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I do plan on reading them at some point. Now, are you sure that this is the last book? There's not going to be a 5th one that pops out in the woodwork?
Well, I'm not 100% certain, but when I looked on her website the other day, the only thing she said about forthcoming books was that she was planning 2 more books in the Heir series, which is the other series that I started. It started with the Warrior Heir, and so far she's written 3 of those. She says she's got 2 more in the works. She didn't say anything about any more Seven Realms books.
Okay, because I got surprised, and you know this, because I thought for sure that I had finished the Iron Fae series by Julie Kagawa. I was positive I finished the Iron Knight, and it was great, and it seemed like everything was all nice and tied up, a good ending, and then, according to the website, there's another one.
Yes, I didn't know it. I told Holly, she had book 4, which so did my library, but I was like, I'll get it from Holly because I'm trying to read so much. I don't know how long I'll have to keep it. So I borrowed hers, and I told her I needed to borrow it, and she's like, there's a 5th one and there's a 6th one on the way, and I'm like, what? Don't tell me that. She says, yeah, I saw it at Walmart and bought it. So I actually have book 5.
Well, see, here's the thing, because this was way back when we talked about the series that we didn't finish, and this was one that I said that I was going to make it a priority that I was going to finish this series. Actually, on Julie Kagawa's website, I noticed they have book 5 listed as part of a different series. It still says Iron Fae, but I think it's The Call of the Forgotten or something like that. That makes me think that this isn't going to be a continuation necessarily of the same series. It's going to be more like a companion series. Yeah. In which case, I still maintain that I have finished Iron Fae.
Works for me. I mean, I'll probably go ahead and read book 5 since I have it, but...
Oh, I definitely want to read it, because I think it's supposed to be about Megan's brother.
Yeah, Ethan.
His younger brother, Ethan. So not the same main character from the first series, but it's all about her brother, who's quite a bit younger than she is. So yeah, he's grown up, and now he's having some adventures of his own.
He was only like 3 or 4, I think.
See, I thought he was like 5 or 6, but he was still young, and Megan was like 18.
He wasn't old enough to go to school. So
okay.
I don't think.
He was like 3 or 4.
Yeah, I think 3 or 4, something like that. I don't know. It's been a while since I've read the first one, and I think that's the only one that really tells how old he was.
But anyway, so yeah, I still maintain that I have read Iron Fae, and I will eventually read the next series as well, because I did enjoy Iron Fae very much.
Actually, I may have finished something. I think the 3rd Faefever book by Karen Marie Moning, I think I finished it since the last time we recorded.
Okay.
Those are... Wow.
That good or that bad?
Well, that interesting. They're not...
Oh, okay.
I mean, they're pretty good. They're worth reading, and they're something that I could probably see myself reading again because they're a lot of fun. They're still... I mean, I think I mentioned in the last podcast the line that the shades were still acting shadily.
Yeah, I think you did.
And there's been a few more lines like that, which they amuse me, but nobody's going to give her a, literature award anytime soon. But they're a lot of fun. I'm still not sure about this whole Faefever from another planet thing, but hey, what can you do?
Yeah.
I mean, they're good enough that I'm working on book 4 now, and then there's 5 of them altogether.
Mm-hmm.
But they're easy to read, and they usually go pretty quickly. And then she's started a new series that goes along, kind of like the same with the Iron Fae books. It's not really, it's sort of a continuation, but it's more of a companion because it's about a different character from the series.
Right.
So I'll probably have to track those down and read them too.
Okay. Well, the only other thing that I'm reading at the moment, I've recently, well, over this past year, I was rereading the Belgarath series by David Eddings. And we had mentioned that when we reviewed Regina's song, and the Belgarath it's a big 5-book series, epic fantasy, and it's as completely different from Regina's song as anything. And one of the main characters in that series is the Sorcerer Belgarath. And after all of that series was tied up, David Eddings went back and wrote kind of a companion volume called Belgarath the Sorcerer. And so I hadn't read that one in a really long time, so I picked that one up to get started. And it kind of goes back and tells, Belgarath is like 3,000 years old, and it's telling his life story and all of the events that took place prior to the start of the Belgarath series, and then kind of what was going on with Belgarath during that series. So it's really interesting because I love to see when authors tell the same story from a different point of view, because you see a completely different set of events, even though you're watching the same thing happen. You see it completely differently.
One of my favorite books ever is that book. I love it, and I just read it. I think last year when I reread. No, last year I read the. Last year I read the Malorian. I didn't read the Belgariad. I read the Malorian.
Well, this year I read both.
And when I finished the Malorian, I went ahead and read Belgarath the Sorcerer because I love that book to pieces. Literally, I've read one copy of it to pieces.
It's falling apart.
Oh, well, it went beyond its falling apart and fell apart, and I sort of duct taped it back together and donated it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's still readable, but if I read it anymore, it's not going to be, so.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Belgarath is such a fun character.
He is.
And he's such a... I mean, I don't even want to say that he's silly because he's not. He's very serious when he needs to be.
He's whimsical.
But the rest of the time, he's just fun.
Yeah.
And, whimsical is a good way to put it. And, I mean, he had such a strange upbringing, being, starting off as this orphan and then just traveling the world and eventually getting, picked up as a disciple by a god.
Mm-hmm. And
having his entire life change and being brought into this whole life and world-changing prophecy. It's a really big book, actually.
It really is.
If you're trying to tell 3,000 years of somebody's story, then it would have to be.
Well, there were long periods when nothing happened.
Yeah. But after I finish it, which I just started it, so it's going to take me a little while, I'm going to go on and finish and read the next one, Polgara the Sorceress, which is the story of his daughter, and pretty much the same sort of deal.
Yeah, it's close to the same story, but it's everything from her point of view.
And obviously she's been in completely different places during the whole thing, so.
Yeah. I started it when I finished Belgarath the Sorcerer, but then something shiny floated by, and I had to read it instead. So I never finished Polgara the Sorceress, but I've read it like umpteen times anyway, so.
Right. Well, I think the thing is that those are pretty big books, and they do take me a little bit longer to read. So I'm going to go ahead and read them now because for 2012 I've already met my Goodreads goal.
Yeah.
And so I don't have to worry about something taking me a long time to read. I wouldn't necessarily start it like, next year because that would eat into trying to finish my goal for next year,
Yeah.
which I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do.
We both met our goal. Yay, us.
Yay! We have way too much reading time on our hands.
I don't see how you have time to read. You're doing everything. I don't see how you have time to sleep.
You know what's funny? My aunt has said the exact same thing about me.
I don't think...
Actually, at one point she said, I'm a little bit worried about you because you're doing all this writing and all this reading and you're podcasting and you're blogging and you have kids and a job and a husband. When do you sleep?
You have a time turner, don't you?
I said, sleep? What is the meaning of this word sleep? I don't sleep.
You have a time turner. That's how you do it.
Actually, I think exactly what I said. I said, sleep is for the weak.
I'll sleep when I'm dead.
I don't think that eased her mind at all. Well, I think we should go ahead and move into our main discussion. And since it was sort of inspired by your post at the tavern, I'm going to let you introduce it.
Okay, this week we are talking about young adult fiction versus adult fiction. And by adult, we mean that stuff that's kind of aimed at a demographic, maybe age 30 and up, rather than stuff that's aimed at kids, middle schoolers, and teenagers. And this got started, I had a discussion with a friend, and this friend, I've recommended her a lot of stuff to read, and she doesn't generally read the stuff I recommended her, and she gives me the excuse that she doesn't like teen fluff. And that got me to thinking, and I posted about it on the tavern, because I was like, these people will agree with me, and I need to be around people who have the same opinions as me right now. And basically what it is, I've read a lot of young adult fiction this year. And you can check out the reading challenge thread on the tavern to see the list of everything I've read. I've read a lot of young adult fiction. And it's not all fluff. And that's what kind of started the thing is I was telling her, it's not all fluff. I've read a lot of it. Young adult fiction is not fluffy anymore. I mean, yeah, some of it is, but there's a lot of adult fiction that's fluffy.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I read all of the Stephanie Plum novels by Janet Ivanovich, and I loved them. They were fun, and I would definitely read them again. But if they got any fluffier, you could use them as pillows. I mean, they're just fluff. That's all they are. But sometimes it's what I want to read because I want something that doesn't take a lot of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But there has been young adult stuff that I have read that I think could have been shelved with, fiction rather than young adult.
Right.
And I think, I don't know, it just kind of irritated me when she kept on, in a derogatory way, calling it teen fluff.
Right. No, I understand exactly what you mean, and I think anytime that I've seen people try and categorize like different books, there's so many books that I enjoy that it's hard to choose what genre they would fit into.
Yeah.
And anytime someone takes an entire genre, and it happens all the time, not just with like adult versus young adult or versus children's, but even just fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say, oh, well, it's just fantasy or it's just science fiction. And those are the only ones. They'll say, oh, well, that's just romance or it's just, and as though, just because something fits into a certain category, and maybe that's not a category that you particularly enjoy reading, that automatically makes everything in that genre less than or, just stupid.
Yeah.
I always hate when people do that.
Yeah, it happens a lot where I live, especially that fantasy is kind of frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what when I first started really reading a lot, like I do now. I mean, I read a lot when I was in school, but a lot of it was, stuff that was assigned to me, and then, the stuff that was in our school library. And my school was tiny. I mean, it was an elementary school, and I was like 15 people in my class, so it was a very small school. So our library wasn't very big either, and there wasn't a lot of science fiction or fantasy in that library, so I was reading, the Judy Blume stuff, and I think I didn't read Chronicles of Narnia until later. So, I mean, when I got into fantasy was when my parents talked me into reading The Hobbit, when I was 12.
Uh-huh.
And that sort of started me down the fantasy path. I've never really been that much into science fiction, but I've read a lot of fantasy. And for a long time, that was all I would read. Because I was young, and I was like, well, I like this, and I don't think I would like anything else, so I'm not even going to try it. And then I got older, and I started, branching out and reading other stuff. And I learned that you really can't judge a book by its cover.
Right.
I mean, I do a lot. I pick up books because the cover looks interesting, but you really can't say, well, that's such and such genre, I wouldn't like it. Because there's so much crossover.
Mm-hmm.
Some books are just so hard to categorize.
Well, yeah, exactly. Take, for example, the Harry Potter books. Sure, they started out as, you could list them as children's literature, especially in the beginning. You could list them as fantasy. But especially towards the end of the series, the themes started getting a lot darker.
Yeah.
And a lot of the situations that the characters found themselves in started getting a lot more mature. And, I was concerned having my kids watch, like, the final movie because of all of the different things that were going to be happening, because I'd read the book and I knew some of the things that were going to happen. And some of the things I think went right over their head because, especially as the series progressed, it became less for kids, like smaller kids, and more for teenagers.
Yeah.
And I know more adults that have read and enjoyed the Harry Potter series than I do kids who have read them all.
Yeah. I mean, well, it was kind of like the first book was aimed at a slightly younger audience, but as the characters in the book grew up, she sort of wrote the books for her audience growing up as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but that's only natural when you have a character that starts off that young and ages 7 years in a series.
Right.
You naturally, you expect the situations they find themselves in to mature as well.
Right.
But I love Harry Potter. I loved Harry Potter from the time I read the very first one. It's one of my favorite series. I mean, it's right up there with the Belgarath and Lord of the Rings, and
mm-hmm.
It's on the top 5 list, definitely.
Right.
And playing Lego Harry Potter is making me want to reread them so bad. I've said this before on the podcast, and I mentioned it in our tavern post. I think the reason I enjoy young adult, especially young adult fantasy, so much is, there's kind of this expectation that when you reach adulthood, you don't live in a fantasy world anymore. You've sort of outgrown the whole having a vivid imagination, and you're supposed to be responsible and, kind of a stick in the mud.
Right.
But people who write adult books kind of write for that demographic, nothing
mm-hmm.
too crazy, nothing, that requires a suspension of belief. But then the young adult stuff, we're writing for teenagers. They're still allowed to have an imagination. They're,
right.
still able to suspend their belief in order to enjoy, magic like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why I enjoy it, is because it is so much more imaginative. And I'm 29 years old, and I am holding on to my imagination for dear life.
Yeah, right. Well, along that same vein, there was a few months ago, actually, like between March and May, and the New York Times, actually, a bunch of articles that were kind of going back and forth talking about young adult work and whether or not it was suitable, I guess the word would be for it, for adults to read it. Kind of along the same thing. Was it, good, solid fiction to read, or was it just fluff? And one of the articles was written by a woman named Patricia McCormick, and she was all for young adult authors, and she said that young adult authors are doing some of the most daring work out there, taking creative risks. And one point that she made, actually I think this is a very good one, said, for a young adult audience, authors have to be at the top of our game. We're competing with Facebook and smartphones, DVRs and iPods, not to mention SATs and extracurriculars. We have to capture and hold our readers' limited attention on page 1 and sustain it until the end. So it's kind of going along the same things, and just with fantasy, but you have to have a really strong, engaging story, because for a lot of teenagers, they have such limited time now.
Yeah.
Just talking to some friends of mine who have some older kids, she has a daughter who's in dance, and that's like a 5 to 6 night a week commitment. She has another child who's in gymnastics. That's also a 5 to 6 night a week commitment. That's outside of school and friends and everything else. And in order for them to have time or want to take time to read, it needs to be something that's, really engaging. And I think authors that write for that audience, they understand that and
Yeah.
they know it. But at the same time, if they're writing something that is trying to draw the reader in quickly and hold their attention, well, it can do that for grown-ups too,
Yeah.
quite easily.
I
And because
mean,
I know I've read a couple of non-fantasy young adult books over the past year, and like one of them, I mentioned it before, was The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky, and another one was Shine by Lauren Myracle. And both of those were aimed for the young adult market. They both had teenage main characters who were in high school. And I wouldn't call either one of those fluffy books at all. They were dealing with some very, very serious situations. Shine is about a teenage girl whose best friend, he's gay, and they live in a very small conservative town, and he's the victim of a hate crime and is basically in the hospital fighting for his life because he's in a coma because he's been hurt so bad. And she kind of knows possibly who might be behind it, and so the story is her kind of fighting her own demons, but also trying to figure out a way to find out who would have done this to her friend.
mm-hmm.
That's not fluffy at all.
No, it's not. I don't, for the right age group, if a kid is old enough to understand, then I don't think it's a bad thing for them to read something like that. They need to learn that stuff like that's not okay.
Right.
So, I mean, hey, even my library, they've got a sign posted above the young adult shelf. Because, I mean, they do. They have the young adult section completely separate from everything else. And they have a sign that says, just because a book says young adult doesn't mean that there's not, sexual themes and violence and things of that nature. Because there's a lot of them that have more violence and stuff in them than some of the adult stuff I read.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the most violent books that I've read probably this year was The Hunger Games.
Yeah.
I mean, there is nothing fluffy about The Hunger Games.
No, not at all.
That is a very serious look at a dystopian future.
And it makes you think.
Yeah, because it's, like you said, it's another thing that like a teenager can pick up and read and realize, the treatment, how these people are treated, that's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, it brings up a lot of ways that you can discuss things. I love when I hear that high school English teachers or literature teachers are using books like The Hunger Games, or even some of them use Harry Potter, to teach different themes or different societal issues, because it's a good way for them to get engaged in it because the books are so well written.
Yeah.
And
for a lot of people, and this includes me, they're a lot more enjoyable than the normal stuff that teachers used to make kids read in school. Because a lot of that stuff at this point is so outdated. I mean, it's not necessarily that it's bad. It's just that a lot of kids, like the Scarlet Letter, we were supposed to read the Scarlet Letter.
Right.
The time period that's set in, the kids have no concept of what life would be like then.
Right.
And that's not to say that I think they shouldn't read it or that it's bad. It's just that if you really want to get your point across, give them something that's a little bit more modern, that's a little easier for them to understand.
Right.
It conveys the message better. So, I mean, yeah, using Harry Potter or The Hunger Games, I think, is a wonderful idea.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not to say that, the Scarlet Letter is not something that should be taught, or any of the other classics that, we had to read. But at the same time, I remember when I read the Scarlet Letter in high school, I hated it because the way that it was taught was so boring.
Yeah.
That, I didn't even care, who she had the affair with and who the father of the kid was. I didn't care because it was so boring, and the way it was presented was so boring. I did enjoy it when I went back and read it in college because I had a better teacher. But I think you need to find more of a balance with that. Because I know that one of the most gripping, actually, this is uh, addressing young adult and also addressing another genre that is sometimes included in fluff, and that would be graphic novels. But the two most inspiring, chilling, memorable books that I have ever read about World War II, one was a young adult novel called The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, and the other is the graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And they're both completely different, but I've learned so much about the Holocaust from reading those books.
And my library has The Book Thief. I've thought about reading it.
It is just an amazing book, and it is a young adult book. That's where it is stuck all the time. It is a memoir of the Holocaust that is narrated by death. What is fluffy about that?
Yeah, that's
not a darn thing.
No, I mean it just annoys me. I mean, I don't mind if you don't like something, that's fine. It doesn't bother me. Say that I don't like it. Say it's not for me. But don't put down an entire category. I don't really want to say genre, because young adult's not exactly a genre. It's more of just a categorization. Don't put down an entire group of something because you don't like the experiences you've had with it. Because it's not all the same, I promise. Because I have read young adult stuff that wasn't that great. I mean, I've gotten books from the library that I have read part of, and I've been like, I can't finish this. And I've had to take it back because I couldn't read it. It's just, okay, either the writing's not that great, or the story didn't engage me. You know, there's some reason why I couldn't finish it. I will concede, there is a lot of young adult out there that is fluff. But there's a lot of adult out there that's fluff too. So, I mean, you can't really refuse to read it all because you think part of it's fluff, because that applies to everything. I think with authors, young adult has become such a profitable outlet now. I mean, there's so much new young adult stuff coming on the market in the past couple of years, and so much more coming out in the next few years. And I love that a lot of them are writing these epic series in the fantasy genre like we used to see, like the Belgarath, that hook you with the first book and leave you hanging so that you have to read the next one. I mean, Cassandra Clare is a master of ending a book on a cliffhanger and making me want to explode before the next one comes out.
She is good at that.
So, I mean, and two, you said something about characters being teenagers. How many epic fantasy series that aren't classified as young adult have we seen that have a teenager as lead?
Oh, there's probably too many to even count.
Exactly. I mean, just because the lead is a teenager doesn't mean it's a young adult book.
Exactly. And I think for me, especially when reading the non-fantasy young adult stuff, it's not so much that, you know, I think, oh, well, it's aimed for teenagers because it's about teenagers. It makes me remember what that time in my life was like. And again, I'm going to mention Perks of Being a Wallflower. That book made me feel so nostalgic, but that's not quite the right word, because I didn't go through any of the situations that those characters went through. But just, it was so interesting being brought back into that mindset that you have when you're younger, of just having infinite possibility ahead of you. And, you know, when you get older, that goes away.
Yeah.
Because reality sets in and you realize that, you know, you're not going to become a famous musician or a Broadway star or, you know, anything like that, because you have to start having goals that are more realistic.
Yeah.
And let's just completely be honest, that sucks.
Yeah, it does.
You know, having to be a grown-up and be realistic all the time is it's such a downer.
Yeah.
And so when I go back and I read, you know, these young adult fiction books, it reminds me of the time in my life when life wasn't like that, and where, you know, everything seemed to be possible. And it's fun to kind of get lost back in that again, and then come out of it and go to work, or, you know, take the kids somewhere and go back to my life where I have all these responsibilities now. But I don't see anything wrong with being able to get lost in that mindset again, just for a little while.
No, I mean,
it's fun.
That's kind of the whole reason why I read. It's because it's kind of an escape, and it's entertainment. Yeah. I mean, it just, and, you know, too, talking about young adult versus adult, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are generally accepted as adult works. They're generally shelved. Well, my library doesn't split by genre. There's no science fiction, fantasy distinguished in the shelves. It's just fiction, nonfiction, young adult, juvenile, or reference.
Yeah, mine's pretty much the same way.
Except for, like, they have a lot, somebody donated, like, a lot of Star Wars paperbacks and a lot of Star Trek paperbacks, and they do have those separate. But everything else is, you know, basically it's fiction or nonfiction. And The Hobbit is generally shelved in fiction, not the young adult. Yet, The Hobbit wouldn't have been published had Stanley Unwin's 10-year-old son not enjoyed the book. So, I mean, by that, you would think Hobbit should be young adult. If a 10-year-old can read it and enjoy it, then, you know, that's a good case for it being classified as young adult. But yet, so many adults read The Hobbit.
Oh, yeah.
And, I mean, The Lord of the Rings is probably one of the best series of the 20th century, 21st century even.
I would
agree with that. But definitely of the 20th century. I mean,
yeah.
It was such, I don't remember, my parents told me that back when, I think it was when Return of the King came out. It may have been when The Two Towers came out. I don't remember which book it was. It was the second one or the third one. That when it came out and people started reading it, and this is, I believe, in the introduction that's in my copy, that, like, the subways in New York, people were painting Frodo Lives on the walls. Because, I mean, it was that big of a sensation, you know. So, yeah. And at the same time, I mean, Lord of the Rings not so much, because when Tolkien wrote it, it's a lot more complex than The Hobbit. Right. I mean, and even me, as much as I read and as much as I love The Lord of the Rings, I still, you know, it takes me a while to get through it because it's so complex.
Right. It's not something that you can read quickly. You really have to take the time and absorb it.
So, I mean, you know, not a lot of 11 and 12-year-olds are going to be reading Lord of the Rings, but they can read The Hobbit easily.
Well, and see, the thing is with The Hobbit, I know my husband is a big Tolkien fan, and he is really excited that the Hobbit movie is coming out this year.
Me too.
Yeah, so am I. And we were talking about that, and my husband had read The Hobbit for the first time, I think he said, when he was 12. And it's still a story, you know, this many years later that he enjoys. So there's so many books that kind of transcend just being for kids or appealing just for kids and appealing for adults.
Yeah. I mean, well, my thing is this. Just because a book says it's young adult, don't take it for its word. You know? Right. Read the blurb. If the blurb sounds interesting, read the book. Young adult authors, there are some very, very talented authors out there that are writing for a young adult audience.
Absolutely.
Now. I mean, like Cassandra Clare. And Julie Kagawa. And, you know, Cinda Williams Chima. Those books are shelved as young adult at my library. I think they could be shelved in fiction.
Yeah, and those are some great fantasy ones. And then outside of the fantasy genre, you have people like John Green and Maureen Johnson and Lauren Myracle, who I mentioned before. Their books are wonderful. I've read several of them, and some of them, I would say some of Maureen's get a little bit fluffy, but they're also really fun stories.
Yes. See, that's the thing, is fluff is not always a derogatory term. Fluff generally is something that is easy to read, it's fun, and it doesn't require a lot of deep thought on your part. And sometimes that's what you need. That's what you want. That's what you enjoy. That's what you want. It's something that you don't have to put a lot of thought into. I mean, it's like the difference between reading Lord of the Rings and reading, you know, something that's not quite that epic.
Right.
You know, sometimes I want to read Lord of the Rings. Sometimes I want to get so deeply involved in something that I'm completely lost, and then sometimes I want something that doesn't require me to think that hard, that I can just read and enjoy and not worry about trying to keep up with who's going where and what's going on over there. And it's you can't say that fluff is consistently a bad thing.
No. Well, I wanted to read a couple of things that some people over at the tavern had included in this discussion.
Yeah,
just because several of them made some really good points. And anybody who wants to find this discussion thread, you can find it over at the tavern website. And that website is www.maltavern.com, just in case you want to go over there. We had actually a pretty good discussion about this one. But I want to start with a user named Lensman. He wrote, or I'm not sure if it's a he or she actually.
Him, I believe.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's one of Marita's friends.
Yeah, and he's fairly new to the tavern. I don't know him as well. It says, so all YA is fluff. Has your friend come across his dark materials? About as unfluff as I can imagine, but squarely in the YA bracket, which I would agree with. Ditto Garth Nix's Abhorsen trilogy, which I've never read, but apparently that one's the same way.
And we're going to read it in the book club.
Oh, is that the first one?
That's Sabriel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, good. Then I'll get to read it. Much of the Andrea Norton YA stuff can be very dark and very effective. For that matter, do the later Harry Potter novels count as fluff? Me personally, I don't think so.
Mm-mm.
On the other hand, there's a substantial amount of adult fiction, meaning not for kids rather than porn. Okay, yeah, we get that. Which is thoroughly and appallingly fluffy. I can't offhand think of anything I want to insult thoroughly, but basically this squarely hits Sturgeon's rule. 95% of everything is rubbish. Or in this case, fluff, as your friend is trying to say. On the third hand, fluff can be fun, which is what you were saying. There are books out there which don't have any literary merit or deeper substance, but are just fun to read. And he gives a couple of examples of that. On the fourth hand, somehow he has four hands, there are books which appeal to young and old. I can think of a number of books that have been marketed both as young adult and as adult. So, which is also a very good point. There's several that are in both areas. And actually, you mentioned Morita. She comes up with that point as well, because we were talking before about the Belgariad, and she wrote Garion, who's the main character of the Belgariad. He was a teenager, and I've seen those books shelved in both young adult and the general fiction sections of libraries.
Well, none of my libraries have those, so I mean, I've never really seen them shelved at my library, but every time I go to a bookstore, they're just always in science fiction and fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Never really seen them.
Yeah, they're in the adult section.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're in the adult section, but again, Garion, actually at the beginning of the book, he's younger. How old is he in the first one? He's like 12,
yeah.
maybe 14?
11 or 12.
He's really young. And yet, like you, I've always seen them shelved in the adult section.
Well, I mean, especially by the end of the Belgariad in Janner's Endgame, he's like 15.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Malorian, he's in his 20s.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and like I said, that's not the only. A lot of Mercedes Lackey, her books are always shelved in the adult section of the science fiction and fantasy, but a lot of her characters are teenagers. Vanya from The Last Herald Mage was a teenager. In the Mage Winds and Mage Storms, Carol and Elspeth are both teenagers. In the Collegium Chronicles, her newest Herald series, Mags was 12 or 13 when the story starts off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of her characters are young teenagers. There was another one I was going to use as an example, and I forgot what it was. But I mean, that's Terry Brooks. I think a lot of his characters in his Shannara series, they're teenagers. 16, 17, 18 years old. So, I mean, if you're going to categorize books as a young adult based on the age of the characters, then I would say at least 50% of the fantasy genre is going to make a jump.
Yeah, at least, if not more.
Yeah. Because, I mean, it's pretty standard when you're writing a fantasy story that your characters usually are no older than 18 unless they're, incidental characters. Your main character will be between the ages of 15 and 18.
Mm-hmm.
That's fairly standard in the fantasy genre.
Yeah. Well, because so many fantasy stories also end up kind of being coming-of-age stories.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know Garion goes through that process where he has to go from being like a young kid to, becoming a leader. And That's generally done not just mentally as they're, learning about, like in this case, who they really are or like their true identity, but also as they're actually growing up. Well, another person, as we're talking about fantasy, another person in the tavern, Savannah, she said that she had someone tell her that no adults read fantasy. And then she put in parentheses, I resisted laughing in her face and rattling off a list of New York Times bestseller fantasy novels. But she continues, so I think there's somehow a feeling that fantasy is worthless among at least part of the population, which I suspect is related to the dislike of YA, as that's where a lot of fantasy is getting published. And apparently the person who had told her this also was a fan of Lord of the Rings, but sometimes Lord of the Rings is put on a different, almost a completely different bracket.
It really is, but Tolkien is kind of the grandfather of the fantasy genre.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I won't say that he started it, because, I mean, there was other fantasy floating around when he wrote Lord of the Rings, but he kind of set the standard.
Right.
I mean, the epic quest, the wizards, the elves, the dragons, the things that, the archetypical things that you find in most fantasy stories now were all there. The quest, I mean, even the coming of age with Frodo. I mean, yeah, Frodo was older than a lot of fantasy characters are, as in he was not a teenager, but by Hobbit standards, he was still young.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't an adult. So, I mean, you have the same thing with Frodo and his coming of age and dealing with the things that he dealt with. So, I mean, it still applies.
Right.
But there's just, it kills me that people want to say, well, I'm not going to read young adult because it all sucks. And it's like, no, it doesn't.
No. And like I said when we started this, I think anytime that you try and judge an entire genre or an entire classification of books, you're going to miss out on a lot of things that are really, really good. And maybe your friend did read one young adult book and it was really bad. I'm not going to say that there's not bad ones out there. There's a lot of bad books in every genre.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe she thought that it was silly or maybe she thought that it was stupid. But that doesn't mean that all of them are like that. And I think I said in the Tavern Post that I don't even look at the age that something's aimed for anymore.
No, I don't either.
Because there's plenty of books that are considered children's books that I love reading. And I'm definitely not a child anymore.
Percy Jackson.
And I've never read those, but I've heard that they're good.
But they are shelved in juvenile fiction at my library,
mm-hmm.
which is younger than young adult fiction. I've read the first 3, I think, and they were really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't really, to me, they would be more young adult than juvenile fiction, because I think Percy Jackson is 14 or 15.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really remember exactly, but they should be. And at the same time, I read the Green Rider series by Kristen Britton. That's just fantasy. That's not young adult. That's just fantasy. It should not be on the young adult shelf. I mean, the only thing that makes that series young adult is Kerrigan was a teenager in the first book. And by teenager, I think she was 18, 17.
Mm-hmm.
But by the end of the series, she's in her mid-20s. Well, actually, not the end of the series, the fourth book, where, Kerrigan ends up trapped in a stone box, and that's where the book ends. But anyway, I'm not happy about that, because it takes this woman like 4 years to write a book, and that one was published in 2011, so I've got a while to wait to find out what happens.
Oh no.
But, yeah, there's so much crossover. You can't say for sure that something is young adult without reading it.
Yeah. And even then it's hard to tell, because I've seen books that have teenagers as main characters that weren't considered young adult. And then also, but even then, when I was a teenager, there were a lot of books that would have been considered adult books that I loved to read.
Yeah.
And as far as like the fantasy stuff goes, I mean, that's a huge part of the YA market is in fantasy. But I think that that's a really good thing.
I do too.
Because I think that they're kind of using that as a way to expand the genre as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I like I said, I've read a lot of fantasy. I've read good fantasy, I've read bad fantasy, and it had gotten to the point where a lot of the new fantasy that was coming out and showing up on the adult shelves was just, it was either the same story that I've read 100 times, or it just wasn't that good.
Right.
And the young adult, like you said, because the authors are having to compete with things like Facebook and the internet and the iPhones and kids that are doing dance or extracurricular activities, and they have to write something that's good enough to make these kids want to make the time to read it. And as a result of that, they write really, really good stories. So,
yeah.
I mean, that's the best fantasy that I have read in the past, I would say 2 years, has been things that my library has classified as young adult.
And the thing is too is I always kind of just shake my head when people think that just because something is actually aimed at teenagers that automatically means that it's crap, because any teenager who loves to read and is going to pick up like a lot of these books, that they're not stupid.
No, they're not. they're smart. And
so, all of these young adult authors, especially since they don't have as much free time as maybe we did when we were teenagers, they are pretty discerning when it comes to what they want to read, and so they have a pretty high standard for what they want to read, because if they're going to take the time to read it, they want it to be really good.
Right.
And so, don't insult the teenagers. A lot of teenagers are really, really smart, especially the readers.
I mean, think about yourself when you were a teenager and you were reading.
Oh, yeah.
Is the only thing you enjoyed fluff? Well, no. Well,
no.
Then what makes you think that that's all that's being written for teenagers now?
Yeah.
Granted, when I was a teenager, I was reading things like Lord of the Rings, and I mean, I distinctly remember rereading Lord of the Rings when I was a senior in high school, and it was right before the movie came out. I mean, they had announced, I think, the first movie, and I was rereading Lord of the Rings when I found out they were making a movie, and my chemistry teacher, Coach Ellis, he was awesome. I was reading in class one day because we would have time, he would teach the lesson, and he would give us time to do our classwork. And I was usually one of the first ones to get done with my classwork. So I carried a book around with me, and I pull out Lord of the Rings and start reading one day, and he makes a comment about it. So for the rest of the semester, as I reread these books, I would finish my classwork, and then I would sit at the desk with the teacher, and we would discuss Lord of the Rings while we were waiting on everybody else to get done. And it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But, I was reading, stuff that was definitely not young adult when I was a teenager. But at the same time, I did read a lot of young adult stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
But really, though, back then, when I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction, most of it that came out then was marketed at adults.
Right.
My reading tastes haven't really changed that much, but the bracket where the stuff I read is being published has changed.
Right.
And that's why it's unfair to say all young adult is fluff, because 10 years ago, a lot of this stuff would never have been published as young adult.
Right.
It would have been marketed as fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And not pointed at that audience. But, so, I mean, it especially for her, because she loves fantasy. That's what she likes to read. The friend that, I had this discussion with. And if she would just read some of the fantasy that's come out in the young adult, she would see what I see. That it's not that there's a lot more young adult authors. It's that publishers have changed the target audience for what these authors are writing.
Right.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of authors that say, oh, I'm going to write a young adult book. And that's what they do. But at the same time, there's a lot of authors that say, I write fantasy, but my publisher is marketing it as young adult.
Right.
So, I mean, you have to allow for that and be willing to read something that shows up on the young adult shelf to find a good book.
Right. Well, basically, I mean, just to sum up, as far as I'm concerned, as long as a book is telling a really good story and has interesting characters that have some depth to them that aren't just like, cardboard cutouts of something, and as long as it has a good plot that doesn't have too many holes in it, I'll accept a couple of plot holes, but as long as there's only like, one or two, and if it's something that really makes you feel something,
yes,
then I consider it to be a good book. I don't care what it's marketed as. I don't care what its genre is. I don't care what its intended audience is.
Right.
If it's something that has like all of the building blocks for a really good story, then I'm going to read it, I'm going to enjoy it, and I'm going to consider it a good book, and I'm going to recommend it to all of the people I know.
Exactly.
Even the ones who don't read.
Yeah, see, that's me. It's like, look, you need to read this because it's awesome. I mean, I spend a lot of time saying that. I read a lot. And I'm like, somebody please read this because it's really good and I want to talk about it.
Well, that's why we started the podcast.
Exactly. That's why
so then we can find lots of people to talk about it.
I mean, this basically boils down to the old saying, you can't judge a book by its cover.
Or by its classification,
right.
or its genre, or anything else.
Because you're going to miss some really, really good books that way.
Right. Well, we should probably go ahead and wrap this up because we've been talking about this for a while.
Yeah, our podcasts are getting longer.
Well, and that's okay. As long as we don't go too much on tangents, although we still do that from time to time, but that's all right.
It makes us charming.
Oh, sure. Well, if you think we're charming, then please email us and let us know. Our email address is bibliophiles.podcast@gmail.com, and we'll take feedback. We'll take anything you want to add to this discussion. Next week, we are going to do a topic that was inspired by a top 10 list that was a meme over at the blog, The Broke and the Bookish. And we are going to be discussing our favorite heroines who kick some serious butt.
Yes.
So if you would like to join in on that discussion, shoot us an email and let us know what your favorite heroine character is. We're also going to start a thread over at the Tavern, and I gave that web address before, but I'll give it again, www.maltavern.com, and you can post there as well.
Yes, and we would love, the heroine's going to be a good one. Mercedes Lackey's going to get a lot of mention in this one because she writes some awesome heroines.
We will definitely have fun with that one, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
So please email us or visit us on the Tavern. You can also find us on Goodreads and on YouTube. If you listen to us through iTunes, please give us a review and subscribe so you can get our newest podcast as soon as it's released.
Yep, and you can find us on Twitter as well, and that's at Bibanon Podcast. And I try to sort of tweet. I try not to tweet too much because I know that can get annoying, especially if somebody has mobile notifications turned on. But I try to at least tweet like what our next topic is going to be and things. And then you can even tweet your responses at us if you have something, a heroine that you really like. Tweet it at us. We'll read your tweets on air.
Absolutely. So yeah, anything about this topic or next week's topic, please contact us and let us know.
Yep.
So until next week, we will talk to you later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.